Welcome to our third week of our campaign on spiritual combat. And this week we're going to deal with something that's probably a little less likable or a little less enjoyable in the spiritual life, precisely because it's so darn difficult. And it's going to be this: learning how to control our speech, controlling our tongue. And this is something that Father Scupoli has a lot to say about. I just want to first of all bring us to the Bible. Let's bring ourselves to chapter 3 of St. James and see what St. James actually has to say. St. James, when he talks about the tongue, he says this. He says, the man who can control himself in speech, the man or woman who controls their tongue basically, he says, is the perfect man or the perfect woman. You think about that? He doesn't say the person who says a lot of prayers. He doesn't say the person who gives away a lot of money or does all kinds of other things. He says the person who can control themselves when they talk is like the perfect person, the perfect human being. And he goes on to say, he said, our tongue is like the rudder of a ship. You know, you think about on one of those gigantic cruise liners, imagine the Titanic. An immense ship. It was, I don't know how many city blocks long. It's huge. How do you steer the Titanic? A little rudder, just a tiny percentage of that boat, a little tiny rudder, just gets turned this way or that, and the entire boat goes following where the rudder leads. He says, our tongue is like that. The tongue is like the rudder of the body. It's a little small part of our body. I mean, it's really not very, very big. But he said, it leads the whole thing. If we let our tongue get out of control, everything else follows. He actually also uses another example. He says, our tongue is like, imagine if you take a match. He doesn't use the word match because they didn't exist in the time of St. James, but our tongue is like a little flame. You know, imagine you have a small candle, or you have a box of matches or something. You can light an entire forest on fire with that thing. You can go to Yellowstone Park and put the thing ablaze with one little match. If it's the right time of year, things are dry, you do it in the right way, you could legitimately light hundreds of miles of forest ablaze with one little matchstick. That's the power that the tongue has. So how are we going to control this thing? How are we going to make use of it so that it glorifies God? Well, this is where Father Scupoli comes in to our rescue. Father Scupoli says, and this is actually, he's very hard on our speech, okay? Listen to what Father Scupoli has to say. Talkativeness is the mother of idleness, evidence of ignorance and folly, the door of slander, the purveyor of falsehood, and the damper of fervent devotion. Oh, he's almost harder than St. James. His talkativeness, speaking too much, he says, is the mother of idleness. It's the evidence, basically, that we are fools, ignorance and folly. The door of slander, it opens us up to speaking badly and falsely accusing people. That's bad, that's tough stuff. It is what procures falsehood, basically makes liars out of us when we speak too much. And it closes the door on, if you want, it puts a damper on fervent devotion. Well, where does all this come from? First of all, he says there are two basic motivations usually why we talk a lot. And you could probably apply this to Father Eric too, I don't know. But he says, if we're talking a lot, it's usually going to come from the fact that A, we are proud. Well, what are we talking about with pride? What are we looking for when we are proud? Well, when we're proud, we want to have our way. We want to be superior to other people, perhaps. We want to gain respect. How many of and we could probably stop and just apply this to ourselves. How many of our words, when I'm with my friends or anywhere for that matter, how many of my words secretly are aimed at either gaining respect, telling people what to do, proving that we are right and they are wrong, making myself look good? That's pride. And related to that is going to be the sin of vanity. The desire to be loved, for example, the desire to be in the know, the desire to be the one with the juiciest and the latest gossip maybe even the desire to be funny. The class clown. That's simply vanity, okay? And none of those things really come from God. So, what are we going to do about all of this? Well, Father Scupoli gives us some rules, and most of these rules are kind of, if you want, negative, things to be avoided, okay? So get out your pen and paper because there's he gives a lot of little nitpicky points, but all of them are very important. It says, first of all, basically, speak little. Like he said earlier, if you're talking a lot, that's the doorway to all those vices, the doorway to folly and slander and all those other things that Father Scupoli mentioned. Secondly, do not speak loudly or presumptuously. Okay? Again, when we're being really loud, or when we are, in a certain sense, trying to demand that our opinion be known and our opinion be respected and everyone out there is going to know what I have to say about something, where's that coming from? It is not coming from God. We don't see Jesus talking that way about himself. Speak not of ourselves, but of others. This is an interesting one. This is actually one that, if you want, is more positive. Is a lot of the times, if we want to control our speech, if we want to use our tongue the way God wanted it to be used, to speak positively, to build others up, a lot of the time it's a matter of simply taking the focus off of myself and focusing on other people. How many people want to go to a conversation just to hear you talk about yourself? Stop and think about it. Who are the people that are usually most annoying to us? They're the ones who are always talking about themselves. Who are the people that normally that we love to be around? The people who listen to us, the people who let us do the talking, because we all love to be the one in the center. And sometimes there are people where you just go to their house and all you do is listen to them over and over again, or they just keep talking and talking, and they're happy. Why? Because they feel they've been respected and listened to. Well, imagine if a society where all people, of course somebody has to do the talking, but where all people are really actively seeking to show the other respect, to try to find things to talk about that other person wants to talk about, as long as they are not in and of themselves sinful things. When speaking of others, Father Scupoli says, speak of their good, build them up. Again, this is a related point. We have to talk about other people sometimes, and we should talk about other people sometimes, but he says, if we're going to speak about them, do we really need to focus on the bad? Do we really need to be criticizing? Do we really need to have a competition to see who can find the worst thing or the most bad things about a person? Is that really glorifying God? Now, I'm going to get back to that point later when we talk about the second thing we can do to control our tongue, just a minute. But it's certainly something to very much keep into consideration. Father Scupoli also recommends, he says, speak about God, okay? Obviously, if you're talking about something all the time, it's going to make a mark on you. So he says, don't be afraid to speak about God. But he does give us a warning. He says, if you're going to speak about God, we need to be careful, because sometimes, if we're not careful, we can start putting words into God's mouth. We can start talking about God in a false way. We can misrepresent God to other people. And that causes real damage. Especially those of us who are, if you want, priests, or those of us who are catechists, or those of us who one way or another represent religion in the eyes of other people. We have to be really tough on ourselves in this regard. How many times do my words about God, I use God's name maybe to try to convince people of something that I want, try to manipulate God into speaking the words that I want him to say. So we do need to be very careful there. But as a rule of thumb, we should be speaking about God and, of course, speaking to God. Don't take man's judgments too seriously, he says. Okay? So if people are speaking about you, or people make a judgment about something, he says, we shouldn't let it penetrate too much down to our heart. The only one judgment that should really matter is God's. He says, ponder well before speaking. Okay, this is common sense. A lot of times when we finish speaking a lot, then we look back and we're regretful because we realize, you know what, I probably said some things I wish I wouldn't have said. If we would stop and think a little bit ahead of time, probably that wouldn't happen so much. And finally, he says, we should, as much as possible, seek silence, And this is something critical in our day and age. For example, I was just recently, a few days ago, we had our first ever silent weekend retreat for the young people in the parish. We did more or less based on the Ignatian spiritual exercises. It was an interesting experiment, if you want. We had about 30 kids, roughly. What was the most challenging thing? Them trying to keep silence. Frankly, they didn't do too good a job because in our climate, we're not used to it. Perpetually, we have to be, checking something, reading a message, doing something. The silence was, in a certain sense, killing them. But they discovered when we make the effort, when we do the hard thing, we encounter God. We help each other to encounter God. And it creates a climate of joy. Because in the end, when we each encounter God, then when we do speak, the way we speak is going to be different and it's going to build each other up. Okay? And that leads to the second point, which, by the way, is not directly in Father Scupoli's book. But this is something that is very dear within our own spirituality and that I think we all need to really to work on. It's a very difficult virtue. In Spanish, it's referred to as benedicencia. Okay? Benedicencia, basically, it doesn't exist in the Spanish dictionary, by the way. It means speaking well of others. Instead of criticizing or backbiting or gossiping or anything, it means going out of our way to build others up with our words, going out of our way to speak well of other people. It is a difficult virtue to practice, okay? And I'm the first one who has difficulty, I always have. But for example, if we want to grow, if we want to conquer any vice, this is something always to keep in mind. Any vice you want to conquer, no matter what. One of the rules of thumb is, okay, we need to play a certain amount of defense if you want, to use sports terms, okay? What do I mean by playing defense? Playing defense is avoiding the bad thing, okay? One of the best ways we can play defense is by, first of all, focusing on offense. So let me give you an example. I, for example, am a trash talker. When we play sports, I talk a lot. I love to harass people and mess with them and do whatever. It's just the way I'm wired, okay? So as a seminarian in the seminary, for a while, I used to try to, okay, I'm not going to speak, I'm going to kind of bottle it up and everything. Never worked. You're playing, you're having a good time with people, it's always going to come out. So then I made a change of decision. I said, okay, I know that the way I'm wired, and when I start playing and you start getting, your body's flowing and everything, I'm going to be talking. It's part of me, okay? I started focusing on, instead of not talking so much, I said, well, if I'm going to talk, I'm going to make sure I'm speaking positively. I'm going to always use it for complimenting, for praising somebody, for pointing out if they have a good pass or a good shot or whatever. And it works. It works. I'm going to talk all the time. But if I'm using it perpetually to do good things with it, it's a totally different, if you want to excuse the pun, ball game. It's a totally different use of the tongue. And it was something that I found very helpful. Okay? This is what we mean by going out of our way to speak well. Now, there is a danger to that, okay? Sometimes we have to call a spade a spade. Speaking well of others always, or if you want benedicencia, does not mean calling things that are bad good. It doesn't mean ignoring things that are bad that need to be pointed out. It doesn't mean being too afraid, for example. When we need to point out a defect, when we need to point out something bad, if we need to say something bad about another person, because sometimes we do, okay? I think there's a few criteria we need to keep in mind. First of all, who really needs to hear this? If I'm talking to a person who can't do anything about it, then why do I need to complain? If I'm talking to a person that all I'm going to do by complaining about this other person over here is give them a bad impression and they can't do anything about it, then why do I talk to that person? So if we're going to, in a certain sense, complain about a person or say something negative about a person or point something bad out, it should be either A, to the person themselves in a charitable way to help them recognize this is what's there. That's part of honesty, okay? Or to the person who can do something about it. Not to somebody who doesn't need to know anything about it, who's only going to gossip, who's just going to judge people badly. Secondly, we should ask ourselves, what are my motives? And this is where we have to be brutally honest. Am I motivated by jealousy? Or am I really motivated by the desire to help this person, the desire to protect innocent people, the desire to do something good? And thirdly, we should ask ourselves, am I in the right state of mind? Okay, what do I mean by that? in the heat of the moment is usually not the best moment to do something like that. If I'm all pumped up, if I'm all angry and agitated and worked up, that's probably not going to be the best moment, unless it's a real crisis moment where it's, saving a person's life or something. Usually we should try to wait until we're calm and recollected to do those kinds of things, okay? And then finally, we do need to avoid timidity. Sometimes, like I said, you have to call a spade, okay? So there are times when if we don't point out something bad, it's a defect on our part. We're actually committing a sin of omission, okay? When we have to do that, we should always pray for prudence, and we should attack not so much the person, but the vice, okay? When I have to point out a defect, I'm not attacking you. I'm attacking perhaps the fact that you have something there that causes problems. You are a person that I love, you are a person that I respect, and precisely because I love and respect you, I need to point this out. It's a totally different thing than passing a judgment on you and saying, no, this guy's no good, this person is just doing it to be evil on purpose. I don't know that. I have no clue. I can judge, I can guess, but my judgment is going to be false. That's up to you and God. But what I can do, and perhaps sometimes have to do, is just simply point out the thing itself without ascribing motivations, and then leaving it at that. So these are our tips for spiritual combat. To learn how to control the tongue, training it not only to avoid what is bad, seeking, for example, those things, seeking more silence, seeking to avoid excessive conversation, but learning also to train our tongue in order to use it for what is good. If we can win in that battle, like St. James says, you and I will become perfect men and women. We'll be equipped for every good thing, as St. Paul says, and we will be victorious in the spiritual war. God bless you.